Hey there team, welcome back to the channel and welcome to South of Midnight. Or rather my overview of it and rather my sort of older format overview. I flip-flop between styles. This has kind of shook it up for me a bit. I've played this for about 5 hours so far. Going off the chapter numbers and that, I think I'm about halfway through. I have been enjoying this, absolutely. And yet, I do not want to review it in full and give it a score because most of the people in my core audience I probably wouldn't recommend this to, but that's not to say that it's a bad game. So my scoring system kind of goes out the window a little bit, but suffice to say, this is really good if you fall inside the target audience, which is to say people, maybe some old boys with nostalgia to things like Labyrinth. In fact, Labyrinth, the movie, by the way, you know, Jennifer Connelly when she was a teenager, that sort of thing. This to me is very much Louisiana Labyrinth, which might make you pick it up sight unseen on those grounds. And don't get me wrong, I grew up watching that movie and I'll watch it for nostalgia, but I probably wouldn't watch it, you know, brand new, fresh-eyed at my age now. But I would recommend it to your kids. And I know we've got a lot of old boys with, you know, looking for recommendations for their kids, etc. So a little bit of preamble and setup. It's a good game. Dare I say it's a great game. It might not necessarily be for you, but it might be for your kids or your niece and nephews, that sort of thing. A dark fable type story. It's got actually some pretty dark themes, you know, like one of the second themes. I don't want to give too much away, but you know, there's a mother grieving for a very young child death, and it's not, I wouldn't say explicitly graphic or anything like that, but it's not got the rubber corners on the edge of the table that a lot of modern fantasy for kids seems to have. Again, the Labyrinth example will keep coming up, you know, that sort of darker mouthfeel stuff that we kind of grew up with as kids in the first place. But yeah, I really like it. I think the main protagonist is really cool, this teenager that she's fairly, you know, likable. If you've seen nothing but box art with, you know, her dodgy tats and nose rings and all that sort of stuff, you might be prudish about it and just see a DEI nightmare coming down the track. And don't get me wrong, I understand people's reluctance without going into all that too much. I get it. There's a bunch of people that will not touch this game on the principle that it looks a certain way, and that part of the industry has done themselves no favors by creating that sort of adversity and pushing people that far. Inversely, all that sort of DEI stuff has created a situation where this is a game which I would argue is actually devoid of all of that. The chick's black because she's black. That's about as complex as it gets. In Louisiana, there's probably a 50-50 that you're gonna be. But because of all this nonsense being pushed in the industry, they have poisoned their own well, in that this is a great game without any forced diversity from the time that I've spent with it. But like I said, there's a whole chunk of people that just will probably not touch it on principle, and that's a bit tragic. Let's leave all that crap behind, but might as well mention it anyway. It is developed by Compulsion Games. Now, they did We Happy Few, which I barely touched years ago, and that was a little bit different from their previous game, Contrast. This feels a lot more like Contrast, and I have very fond memories of that. I think it was one of the first PS Plus games on PS3 or PS4 or some crap like that. But, you know, I have this little cordoned off chunk of my mind remembering this novel puzzle platformer. And in a way, this returns to the roots. This is very much one of those character action games come 3D platformer from a previous generation. Funnily enough, the thing that sprung to mind the most while playing this was Voodoo Vince. But even things like Conkers or the remaster of it or whatever, but that might give you a bit of an idea. Blinks the Timekeeper. I know I'm favouring Xbox a bit here, but that's what the flavour was for me then. But if any of these games sort of jump out at you, this is what's going on here. Kind of a bit of a time capsule game. It's really pretty. I really like the art and the direction. It's very original. As best as I can tell, a lot of the mythology is fairly original as well. I gave it a little Google, but unless this is some sort of deep-seated fantasy from the South that, you know, I'm totally missing somehow, I think a lot of the concepts and ideas in this are pretty original. Dare I say, this is the sort of thing that I, as a gamer, am generally begging for, as opposed to sequelitis and just recycling the same crap over and over again. But essentially, it does follow the structure of a sort of a youth's journey, you know, trying to grapple with stuff. They haven't given it all away, but it seems to be that there's some friction with Hazel's mum, Hazel being the main protagonist. The game kicks off with flood season going particularly Burko, and she lives with her mum. They have a little bit of a tense back and forth. Her mum's a social worker and has a lot of stuff that she deals with that she tries not to bring home, and a big core of the sort of nightmare scenarios that you work through in this are very clearly a sort of a sympathizing and understanding with Mum's worldview. It's well done. Whether you like the setup or not, you can't deny that they do it well. Anyway, the trailer gets washed away in a flood and off goes Hazel trying to basically track down where Mum is. And there's a bit of a breadcrumb trail. And along the way, you're coming into people's kind of buried grief and secrets. And you're this weaver thing, it's a sort of fantasy hero that can untangle the knots, and so it's dealing with these sort of overarching broad concepts to deal with, ultimately working through little mini vignette stories of people's grief. And like I said, there's some pretty dark elements of it, but it's all really original and I really like it. You take their little snippet of their story and they bottle it up in a literal bottle, and then you have to fight a big old boss, and some of the boss set pieces are pretty marvelous. Along the way, you've got this narrator, this catfish, who's got his southern drawl down to an absolute T. It's very musical, and I feel like that might be one of the weakest parts, which breaks my heart because the composer is Olivier Denevieux, or however you bloody pronounce it as an Australian. Sorry, mate, if you ever watch this. But I will say this now, he's my favourite composer in all of the games industry. He did the original Alone in the Dark from '08, which everyone pretends didn't happen. It's one of my favourite games. More contemporaneously, he's done stuff like A Plague Tale, Innocence, and you can feel the brushstrokes of a lot of his stuff. He likes, choral music in the background, and I don't think he necessarily has done anything wrong here. The whole dragging southern slow old-timey music is good, but it doesn't really make for great chase sequences and all that. They do the best with what they've got. But again, it's a kind of musical, and it's kind of not what I would call a good musical. Occasionally some of the beats pop off, but it feels like whoever the lyricist is or had that component written in, and look, I'm not one for constructing musicals, but surprisingly, I kind of grew up with a fair few. Don't judge me too much. I've got a soft spot for musicals, at least good ones. And a lot of the sort of info dump lyrics to these songs aren't very good. It's not very well written, and it's more just info dump. And you mix that in with the sort of thematic sameness of the choral singing and all that, and it was all sorts of blurs together into a kind of mush that's not very good. So the weakest parts are the more musical bits. The boss fights have some kind of cool music numbers, I'll give them that, but generally speaking, outside of when they're trying to tell a story with essentially spoken word lore dumps in lyric form and it's just normal background music, that's great. As far as the actual gameplay loop, it's sort of split into twofold. You have a combat system, which is actually quite fun if light. Not everything has to be Dark Souls, and I feel like that might be the criticism. Like, it keeps you involved. It's got a couple of different abilities that you upgrade through a tree, but essentially you put these little arenas, you've got your two little hook weapon things that you attack enemies with. There's perfect timing dodges, there's a basic attack, a couple of special abilities, and then you sort of finish up the round. And the game metes out new abilities as you go along at a pretty even pace, which is a good thing. A lot of games mismanage that. I've talked about this before. You can play a game and you feel like it never really works until the end when you have all your powers, and the developers clearly designed it back to front. They didn't design the bit where you don't have any powers at the beginning as fun. This gets it, right? And it's one of those things where it'll reward me yet another power, and I'll be like, oh, well, that's a nice little, I thought we were kind of at full speed. One of the funnier ones is this crouton dude, because it is doing a bit of an Alice in Wonderland. They haven't really said it, but I'm pretty sure all the monsters and that you're coming up against are sort of like stuffed toys, and there's something about their animation. It's at a lower frame rate, which is very clever and cool, but if you look closely at the textures, they've sort of got like a textured fabric to them. But she had like a stuffed toy friend which has sort of come to life in this blurring the lines between reality and fantasy, called Crouton, this ugly little throw pillow toy, and you can use him to sort of almost Lego Star Wars into areas that you can't get, into little holes and that, and he's just making Simlish emotes, just having a great gay old time. And so you throw this bloke around and he goes into little areas, and you can use him in combat to possess dudes. So it's actually pretty involved. There's a fair bit going on there. The game plays out kind of linearly. There'll be little side areas to pick up upgrade materials for your upgrade tree, but there's a Dead Space style guiding line that can tell you where to go. And the platforming is, I'll admit, it's getting a little repetitive now, but the rhythm and finding it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it. And I suppose, to jump ahead, I feel like this game may outstay its welcome. I'm surprised that it's got so many more hours in by the look of it. Like I said, I seem to be halfway through the chapters, and I do wonder if it will get long in the teeth by the end. But you get into a pretty cool rhythm with the platforming. It's not always perfect. I found myself falling off some tree branches, and it seemed a bit janky more than fair. But I'm at a point where you got double jumps, dashes, hook line things, glides, and it's all pretty involved and fun. So generally speaking, I've just really enjoyed my time with it. I have. However, having said all of that, would I pay full price for this? Because the devs gave me this key, and it's going for $70 Australian, that's pretty expensive. I mean, it's not top end AAA, but it's not cheap either. And I look, I try not to speculate outside of my line and going into industry at large, but I wonder if this game's kind of doomed to flop, because ultimately it's going to resonate with kids. I really do think, or teens, if they can find out that this game is actually for them and not what is increasingly the adult gaming industry. And I don't even mean that in explicit terms. I think a lot of people that control what is and isn't popular are aged out gamers, kind of like myself with microphones, right? So the hope is that this finds its younger audience, but even then it's asking a pretty steep price for what I would probably call a kid's game. Anyway, I'd be curious to see how it goes. I didn't want to do a full review, but I've formulated an opinion. I recommend it. It's one of those things, get it definitely on sale or on cheap, or it's probably on Game Pass because it's an Xbox game. Check it out there. And like I said, your kids better than me, but I reckon this might be a candidate for some people's kids. Or if you're just feeling some plain old nostalgia from the days of Labyrinth and Willow and Never-Ending Story and all that sort of stuff. I'm not saying this has been painful for me to play. I've really enjoyed aspects of it, and at the very least, the fact that it's shooting its shot. It's doing its own thing in an increasingly derivative and safe industry. That part should be at least celebrated. Anyway, team, might just leave it there for the time being, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.